Scalping on the North American continent has been carried out for thousands of years. Archaeological evidence indicates it appeared in the Archaic period around 2500 BC. Over 500 skeletons were found in a pit at Crow Creek, South Dakota. Most showed evidence of scalping. The victims were killed in 1350 AD. The culture of scalping revolved around many tribes believing that the hair was the location of a person's spiritual power. Some tribes believed it to be the nest of the soul. In battle, when a man scalped a fallen foe, he was taking the victim's spirit and strength for himself. Such importance was placed on the hair that often the victim might be left alive after the ritual, as they were of no consequence after scalping. The taking of a scalp of a woman or child was considered honorable because it signified that the scalp taker had dared to enter the very heart of the enemy's territory. Sometimes the victims, if they lived, were treated like ghosts in their own villages. Others were treated as spiritual beings. The men of the Mohawk tribe grew their hair long across the top of the head and shaved the sides. It sent a clear visual message to the enemy of a man's courage. It was a provocative "F you" or "I dare you to try and take it." Almost every young Indian brave learned his death song from an early age. They were schooled in the tortures they could expect the same if captured by the enemy. A stake stood in the middle of many Indian villages, and there the village could watch the torture and humiliation of a captured enemy. Often women and children would do the torturing, as it further humiliated the enemy. The captured victim could be burned at the stake, scalped alive, or suffer many other types of deaths. The captured warrior had prepared for his moment of death his whole life, and would bravely chant his death song as long as he possibly could. To suffer the torture without crying out was seen by both parties as the ultimate impersonal courage. Sometimes a warrior displaying such courage was let go and accepted into the tribe, but most died a horrible death. The Indians weren't the only ones who scalped. Dutch and New England colonies as well as the Spanish were known to offer bounties for Indian scalps. The scalps held no spiritual significance for them. They were just a convenient and easily carried proof of death. Unscrupulous bounty hunters also murdered Mexicans for their scalps, as they looked the same as the Indian scalps. We see many photographs today of scalped victims who survived the brutal ritual. Some revisionist historians think that scalping was just a barbaric practice and the natives rarely practiced it. And if by chance they did scalp, it was because the white man had committed it first, when in reality, it was a complex spiritual ritual that had developed in their culture over hundreds of years. The short-sighted do-gooder who denies the Native American of his history because of our modern sensitiveness is doing the Native American more harm than good. Robert McGee had just turned 13 when his family set out on the Santa Fe Trail towards New Mexico. The small wagon train also carried other families as they sought a brighter future in the West. As they traveled along one sunny morning, a band of Sioux led by Chief Little Turtle appeared on the horizon. In an instant, the warriors charged down and surrounded the small group of wagons. The next 10 minutes was a bloodbath with nearly every man, woman, and child slaughtered. The young Robert McGee had been shot but still alive, and he was taken before Chief Little Turtle. The chief fired another bullet into McGee. As he fell down on the prairie grass, the chief took a bow and arrow and shot the boy twice, pinning him to the ground. The chief then pulled his knife and scalped the still conscious boy. As Robert lay helpless and bleeding, he watched the warriors plunder the wagons of everything they could carry, before riding away without even a glance towards him. Cavalry from Fort Larned who patrolled the trail came upon the gruesome scene and found the young Robert still alive. He and another boy who was just breathing were taken back to the fort. The other boy succumbed to his injuries and died soon after arriving, but young Robert McGee went on to make a full recovery. Although many scalping victims survived the initial scalping, a large proportion of them later died of infection, including instances where the bare bone of their skull would become necrotic, slowly exposing the brain. This photograph shows Mr. McGee in 1880. Another scalping story happened near the small Texas town of Bastrop. The frontier town had a courthouse, hotel, stockade, general store, and gunsmith, with a few residential houses dotted about. Some farms were also in the area. In 1833, one of Bastrop's first residents, Josiah Wilbarger, was with 4 other men near Bastrop when Comanches attacked. 2 of the men were chased down by the warriors, pulled off their horses, and killed. As that was happening, 2 other men in the group raced off on their horses in the other direction and made their escape. Joseph Wilbarger was hit by an arrow and fell from his horse. As he lay on the ground, a Comanche warrior leapt off his horse and pounced on him. Lifting Joseph's head, he scalped him alive. After the Comanches had taken what they wanted, they drifted off. Joseph still lay where he had fell, his face covered in blood and dirt. As the hours ticked by, Joseph fell in and out of consciousness. At one time, he saw his sister in a dream, saying that everything would be okay, and help was on the way. The men who made their escape reached the farm of Reuben Hornsby and told the residents of the horrible deaths of their 3 companions. That night, Reuben's wife had a dream that Joseph Wilbarger was still alive, and in the morning insisted that her husband and the men search for him. When Reuben and the men returned to the scene, they found Joseph, and although he looked dead, he was still breathing. He was taken to town and nursed back to health. He later learned that his sister, who had come to him in his unconscious state, had died the day before the Comanche attack. Bastrop was always a dangerous spot because of the fact of it being in Comanche country. For decades, the residents of Bastrop could be kidnapped or killed right in the middle of town. The third scalping. Cheyenne warriors Porcupine, Turkey Leg, and Red Wolf, who after committing a raid, were escaping northward until they had reached the Union Pacific Railroad near North Platte, Nebraska, where they joined other Cheyenne warriors. Porcupine had the idea of attempting to stop or damage a train. On the 6th of August, 1867, Porcupine and Red Wolf placed a railroad tie across the track at a point 3 miles west of Plum Creek, now Lexington, and tied it down with wire removed from the telegraph line. They started a large fire away from the obstruction at sunset. 2 white men, Pat Handerhan and William Thompson, were sent out on a handcar to investigate the failed telegraph line. The 2 men pumped the arms of the handcar through the lonely dark night when they saw the fire burning in the distance. They let the car roll, and as they squinted into the darkness at the fire, they hit the obstacle which sent them flying onto the tracks. The warriors, Porcupine and Red Wolf, then drove the men off with rifle fire. The warriors chased down and killed Handerhan. Thompson was shot in the shoulder, and with Cheyenne all around, he played dead, hoping the warriors would leave him alone. But next he heard footsteps of a warrior stand over him, and he froze with fear as his head was lifted back and his scalp was carved off his head. Playing dead, he didn't move a muscle during the bloody ordeal, and before long the warrior left with his trophy. Porcupine and Red Wolf found 2 Spencer carbines in the handcar. These were breech-loading weapons which they did not understand, being familiar only with muzzle-loading rifles. On discovering that the rifles would swivel apart, they discarded them as broken. Encouraged by this recent success, the Indians then tried to do some more substantial damage to the track. The rails were unfastened, lifted, bent aside, and a more substantial barricade built. Late into the night, early 7th of August, 2 freight trains approached. Some of the Indians came out of hiding and pursued the first train on horseback. They fired at it, and even attempted to stop it by lassoing the engine. This did not work, but it did have the effect of causing the train engineer, Brooks Bauer, to apply full throttle to escape the Indians. The train hit the damaged track at full speed. Bauer was thrown through the cab window and died. The survivors of the train wreck retreated back to the second train, along with Thompson, who came out of hiding carrying his own scalp that he had found discarded nearby. The train backed up to Plum Creek Station, picked up the residents there, and evacuated them to Elm Creek. There was an attempt by a doctor to reattach Thompson's scalp in Omaha, but the attempt failed. They kept the scalp for prosperity, and it is now in the public library there. Our last story happened. In 1827, Ho-Chunk warriors began seeing a large increase in white men intruding into their domain, southwestern Wisconsin. Lead had been discovered, and although a treaty had been signed with the government just 2 years before to keep white settlers off Indian land, it had been quickly broken by civilians in their pursuit of the valuable heavy metal. Around 2,000 white men had started living illegally on Indian land to mine and hunting to survive. With tensions running high, the situation had become a powder keg ready to blow. The match that lit the fuse came about when 2 Ho-Chunk warriors had been executed for a murder they did not commit in the town of St. Paul. The Ho-Chunk warriors were enraged by this injustice, and early in the morning on the 28th of June, a warrior named Redbird with 2 others raided a farm near Prairie du Chien. 2 men at the farm, Reggie Gagne and Solomon Lipcap, were killed and scalped. Gagne's 2-year-old daughter, Louisa, was also scalped. When the bodies were found later, the little girl was wrapped in a blanket and taken back to her mother waiting at Prairie du Chien. When Louisa was unwrapped, her mother was stunned to find her still breathing. She was nursed back to health and miraculously survived the terrible scalping wound on the back of her head. She grew into a strong woman who gave birth to 13 children. She always wore a cap over the terrible scar inflicted by Redbird years before. We need to make sure we take good care of our unique history by keeping all the good, bad, and ugly parts intact. The old practice of scalping may seem shocking now, but we should try to understand it within the context of the time it happened, without judging it harshly based on our own standards today.